Let me assure him that we are working intensively and closely with the United States. He asks me about the advice we receive and suggests that I dodged the question on the earlier occasion. Mr. Speaker, I certainly had no intention of doing so, and I can tell him that we receive all sorts of advice from all sorts of places, but we do not, as is the custom and practice, as he knows well, disclose our legal advice, but we are always careful to follow it meticulously. And that is my answer to his question. He asks, is it a matter for the court acting independently? And my answer again is, of course it is. But we don't necessarily have to stay silent in our view on what the court is doing, and we certainly are not. And for his question about the letter from a former Prime Minister, as we have said from the outset, we do not think the ICC has jurisdiction in this case. The UK has not recognised Palestine as a state, and Israel is not a state party to the Rome Statute. But as I say, Mr. Speaker, I think if we split away some of what he said today and the oratory which he customarily displays in this place, we see that the position of the opposition front bench and the government remains very closely aligned.
Chair of the Select Committee, Alicia Cairns.
Speaker, my condolences go out to all the families who've received the most devastating news over the last few days that their loved ones have been murdered, and also to the Popperwell family who have received heinous treatment from Hamas with the publication of that outrageous video. Last week, the committee pushed the Minister for the Middle East to do more to get proof of life for those who have been held hostage, and that remains the call from our committee. Can I welcome the effort on the maritime ports? It is good that that is now in place. However, it will be unable to function come September due to the changes in the tide that will then come in. So this is a short-term solution. Since the 6th of May, when the Rafah offensive started, there have been only 40 trucks that have gone in through the Kerem-Shalom crossing. In Rafah, no fuel has gone in, no medical evacuations have taken place, as aid agencies have started to suspend sending in their own people. And that is extremely concerning. So my question is, when will the Rafah crossing reopen? And will the Erez West crossing finally accept aid not just through Jordan, but also through Ramallah? Because otherwise the amount of aid needed is just not going to get in.
Well, I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for her remarks. She made the point, I think, before about proof of life, and as she knows, this is something which my noble friend Lord Ahmed has been pursuing in direct response, I think, to her committee. She makes the very good point, Mr. Speaker, that the maritime option will only go on for as long as the sea conditions are satisfactory. And that emphasises the importance of getting aid in by road, one of Britain's specific demands of the Israeli government. And she points out that Rafah has effectively been closed for the last few weeks, and the great difficulties that that causes. And we hope very much that there will soon be a deal between Egypt and Israel to put that right.
We come to SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We go down a dangerous road, Minister, if we believe that the rule of law is something from which a government can pick and choose. So, unlike the government, we very much welcome the decision of the International Criminal Court to issue arrest warrants for the Hamas leaders Sinwar, al-Masari and Haniyeh for crimes against humanity and war crimes committed on and subsequent to October the 7th. We have always unreservedly condemned the appalling Hamas attacks, their murders and their hostage-taking, and we repeat our calls for the immediate release of the hostages. Given the ferociously disproportionate Israeli response, one which has seen 35,000 dead, 100,000 injured, tens of thousands of children orphaned, a civilian infrastructure in ruins, the cutting off of food, water, electricity and medical supplies, we also welcome the ICC filing applications for the arrest warrants of both the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Minister of Defence Yoav Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The ICC say they have evidence, including interviews with survivors and eyewitnesses, which show that Israel has intentionally and systematically deprived the civilian population of Gaza with what they need to survive. And they refer specifically to Israel using starvation as a weapon of war and intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population, all acts which constitute a crime against humanity. The ICC has confirmed everything that we have said about the crimes of October the 7th and Israel's use of a collective punishment and ethnic cleansing in response to those crimes. For 8 months, this government has told us that it cannot make an assessment on breaches of international humanitarian law, but it has today, because it suits them, made an immediate assessment on the decision of the International Criminal Court, whose panel of experts is predominantly made up of UK lawyers, and they've done so simply because it doesn't agree with it. It is shameful and unforgivable that for 8 months this government has chosen to deny the evidence of their own eyes and given political cover and munitions to Israel. And we have to assume that if today doesn't put an end to the UK licence of arms export to Israel, then sadly, absolutely nothing will.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the position is simply not in respect of the ICC, as the honourable gentleman set out. And the ICC has done nothing of the sort in what he described. He suggested that they had already found the answer to these allegations, had already exercised their answer. And the truth is that the pre-trial chamber now needs to consider the evidence and then reach a judgment. So let us not jump through all these hoops at once when they are simply not there to be jumped through. He also asks, as indeed did the Shadow Foreign Secretary, about whether we are playing fast and loose with the rule of law. We are certainly not, and I hope that he will attend the main debate today when he will see exactly what the government thinks about the rule of law in all cases. And just because you support the role of the ICC does not mean you have to be devoid of a view on what it is saying, and the government is giving its view. And as I said, Mr. Speaker, we do not believe that seeking warrants will get the hostages out, get aid in, or deliver a sustainable ceasefire, and that remains the UK priority.
Sir Julian Lewis.
This question is in my personal capacity, Mr. Speaker, not as Chairman of the ISC. In general, I am a strong supporter of the work of the ICC. The terrorist attack was undoubtedly designed to provoke an overreaction by the Israelis and to polarize societies, and it has succeeded in both those aims. May I encourage the Minister to encourage the House in turn to read the ICC's statement in full. It's helpfully available online. And may I urge people with a partisan view on either side of this atrocious issue to take on board seriously what the ICC is saying about the activities of the side they support as well as the side they oppose.
Mr. Speaker, I think my right honourable friend makes a good point about ensuring that the debate is informed by facts and not by rhetoric.
Don Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, I'm a little bit confused. The government has previously said that they will not endorse any military operation into Rafah because that would be against international law. The Minister today said that unless there was a very clear plan of how to protect people and save lives, what's changed?
Mr. Speaker, nothing has changed at all. We have repeatedly made clear that we cannot support an attack on Rafah without seeing a detailed plan. Clearly, that means a constructive plan which abides by IHL on all counts.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that this is a grotesque overreach by the ICC? Courts must also act within the rule of law, and the jurisdiction of a court is something that it is not for itself to judge. The Statute of Rome, which set up the International Criminal Court, clearly delineated the powers of the court. The US and the UK have both previously said that the ICC does not have jurisdiction. Under its founding charter, it can only act against a sovereign state, which is a signatory. The US and Israel are not signatories. Dozens of other countries are not signatories, and Gaza is not a sovereign state. So, putting aside for a moment any purported evidence, the court does not have jurisdiction, and like any other court, like a traffic court or a magistrate's court, it has to act within its powers, the powers set up for it by the international community. So isn't it true that the ICC is acting out with its powers and setting itself up, sadly, as a political court?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I made clear what our position is towards the ICC, but in respect of what my right honourable and learned friend says, I think that many people will agree with what Benny Gantz said this morning. And he said the following: placing the leaders of a country that went into battle to protect its civilians in the same line with bloodthirsty terrorists is moral blindness.
Sir George Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of us on all sides of this House have supported the right of Israel to exist and consequently the right of Israel to defend itself over many years. And we've also condemned the appalling atrocities that were carried out by Hamas on October the 7th. But as the Right Honourable Gentleman said in his statement, after 7 months of fighting, it's becoming difficult to imagine the realisation of a lasting peace. And I agree with him with that. But doesn't he agree with me that until Israel realises that it has to listen to those friends in this House and around the world and take responsibility for its own actions, then our support for them is declining rapidly.
That's absolutely right.
Well, the right honourable gentleman, I think, accepts that Israel has the right of self-defence, but it must exercise it within international humanitarian law. And he makes the point, which I think is so important, that we have to lift people's eyes to what a future settlement based on a two-state solution looks like when this appalling catastrophe is over. And a great deal of work is going on behind the scenes with regional partners, with great powers and through the United Nations to try and make sure we can lift people's eyes and that there is a deal to be done which at long last would draw the poison from this terrible situation.
Andy Percy.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, facts are important, and the facts have not changed since October the 7th, which is that it is Hamas who embed themselves in civilian areas and use civilian infrastructures and put their own people at risk in this conflict. It is Hamas who have committed rapes as a weapon of war. It is Hamas who are still holding innocent civilians hostages, and it is Hamas who went into Israeli communities on October the 7th and butchered 1,200 people, including slicing the breasts of women and the limbs of children. On the other side, we have the democratic, liberal state of Israel with an independent judicial process, a Supreme Court which is respected internationally and which the ICC is supposed to respect. And yet there are people in here who from day one have done very little to call out some of the other behaviour and everything to hold Israel to a standard they do not hold others to. That is why the Czech Prime Minister and the...
Can you... Please, can everybody focus on a question? Focus on a question. Because I'm not quite sure I heard a question there, but nonetheless, I think the Minister has had enough to respond. Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend speaks with great passion and feeling on this subject. And he, I think, will be one of those who, I said, might well agree with what Benny Gantz has said this morning. And I read into the record exactly what he said. And I think there will be large numbers of people, both in this place and outside, who will think that what Benny Gantz said made a lot of sense.
Richard Ford.
you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Cyprus Maritime Corridor is welcome, but it risks acting as a fig leaf for the fact that there is not enough aid getting into Gaza. The Colonna report found that Israeli authorities have yet to provide proof of their claims that UN staff in Gaza are involved in terrorist organisations. For the supply of aid to those Palestinians in Gaza who are innocent, the UN Relief and Works Agency is the only serious organisation capable of it. Yeah. Why won't the British government follow the lead of our Australian, Canadian and European allies and reinstate funding to UNRWA? Yeah.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his comment. As far as the maritime access is concerned, he is right that the best solution always, from the beginning of this, has been access by road. That is by far the easiest and quickest way and least expensive way of getting aid to desperate people. And so he is entirely correct about that. In respect of the Colonna report, I can say that we are still waiting for the OIOS report from the United Nations, and I'm advised that there has been good cooperation between the United Nations and the Israeli authorities on that. And on UNRWA, as I've said, we are waiting for that report. The House, I think, should expect that we will be restoring funding to make sure that humanitarian support is available through that mechanism. But he, I'm sure, will reflect upon the appalling events which were revealed about members of UNRWA staff, and we must complete the process which I set out.
Richard Graham.
Deputy Speaker, the Israeli War Cabinet looks divided. Chief of Staff is pressing for a day-after strategy. The Defence Minister has outlined his concerns, and the former Defence Minister and Chief of Staff, Benny Gantz, has asked to see the government's post-war plan for Gaza Strip with 6 strategic goals, all of which, and perhaps my right honourable friend would care to comment, look very similar to those that he has outlined as our own goals. The former Defence Minister has threatened to resign if the plan isn't announced by June the 8th. Is he going to have to resign, or are there chances that there will be a plan which both he and us could agree with?
Well, I very much hope my honourable friend is correct in saying, and indeed hoping, that there will be a plan, Mr Deputy Speaker. And what he shows in his perceptive question is that there are many voices in Israel. And the fact that he quoted 2 such senior figures, one seeking to know what the day after strategy is, and the other one wanting to see a post-war plan, underlines the response which I gave a moment ago to the other side of the House, that we have to lift people's eyes to the fact that this dreadful conflict will come to an end, and we will then need to have a plan to ensure that the future is very different from the past. And I remind the House that the tremendous progress that was made in Oslo at the Oslo Accords took place on the back of the Intifada. So out of great darkness, we must ensure that a proper plan comes forth.
Sana Begum.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can the Minister explain how this government can possibly justify continuing to support a military campaign that has involved denying civilians electricity and basic services, the starving of civilians and blocking of aid, the bombing of civilian infrastructure, the forced displacement of millions, the killing of journalists and aid workers, and the killing of civilians, including large numbers of children on an unprecedented scale?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, we don't support that. What we support is Israel's right of self-defence, but it must be carried out within international humanitarian law.
James Sunderland.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I think there's a danger from the scope and the timing of the ICC arrest warrants that somehow moral equivalence might be implied, but it is quite clear that the fighting should stop. Can I please ask the Minister what he thinks the impact will be of those warrants?
Well, my honourable friend makes a most interesting point. This smacks of an unworthy, indeed ludicrous, sense of moral equivalence between a murderous, prescribed terrorist organisation and the democratically elected government of Israel, seeking to protect its citizens and recover its 124 remaining hostages.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think when we are talking about the role of the ICC, it's not about whether it's moral, it's about making sure a democratic state falls within the rule of international law. As 35,000, as it's estimated, 35,000 people have been killed, 132 hostages are still held. The Arab League have now called for an immediate ceasefire, deployment of a UN peacekeeping force in the West Bank until a two-state solution is negotiated. Will the Deputy Foreign Secretary answer my right honourable friend's, the member for Tottenham's question, which he failed to, in terms of that offensive in Rafah, and will we join our American allies in responding and stopping all war components being sold?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that is not what the American government has done. They have suspended one shipment, but they have not stopped any of the other supply. And in the first part of her question, the government continues to seek a pause in the fighting, which can lead to a sustained ceasefire, and also get the hostages out and aid in.
Tobias Selwood.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Deputy Foreign Secretary speaks about a ceasefire, speaks about getting the hostages out, speaks about getting the aid in, and talks to resume. But can I ask him to address the bigger picture? Because behind Hezbollah, behind the Houthis and behind Hamas sits Iran, arming and training these extremist non-state actors. And as much as we debate the possible long-term governance and security solutions for Gaza, they are unlikely to stand the test of time until the challenge of Iran's disruptive proxy influence across the Middle East is challenged. Now, Iran's destabilising foreign policy is determined by the President, by the Supreme Leader, and by the Foreign Minister. Two of those three were killed in a helicopter crash on the weekend. It's clear for Iran to determine who replaces those. But can I ask whether we can advance our own robust policy to stand up to Iran's proxy influence? Otherwise, we will never secure lasting peace in Gaza.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend, the former chairman of the Defence Select Committee, is right about the malign influence of Iran through its proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas and the Houthis, on the situation in the Middle East. And we hope that Iran will cease to disrupt in the way that it does through its proxies. And it may well be that the events of the weekend offer an opportunity for a reset.
Justin Madders.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. As I understand the government's position on the International Criminal Court, it's because Israel were not a signatory to the original treaty, and because Palestine is not a sovereign state, they don't believe that they have jurisdiction. Well, I think that leads us to a place where anyone can opt out of the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court at any time. I think that's a terrible place for us to be as a government and a country. But if he doesn't agree with that, will he at least agree with me that the letter from the 12 senators from the United States to the ICC, where they said, target Israel and we will target you, and we will make sure all American support for the ICC is withdrawn, is not a place this government will ever be in.
Well, of course, the Americans are not a member of the court, whereas the United Kingdom is. But the point the honourable gentleman makes is an important one, because in this debate about these terrible events and the appalling consequences which have resulted, it is important that everyone chooses their language with care.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Deputy Foreign Minister rightly draws attention to the false moral equivalence inherent in the ICC statement between the actions of sovereign democratic Israel and the most brutal activities of a terrorist organisation. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that that false moral equivalence is always drawn by the enemies of Israel as a way to delegitimise the Jewish state? And does he share my concern with this move by the IEC, not just because of the succour that it gives terrorist groups elsewhere around the world, but the risks within it for ourselves and our own troops as they go about defending our interests around the world?
Well, my right honourable friend expresses himself, as always, with great lucidity. And I think it's very important that that message does not get sent. And that is why I repeated what Benny Gantz had said, and also in response to our honourable friend, who is no longer in his place, why I think that the sense of moral equivalence is repugnant.
She Anwara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On April the 5th, the Foreign Secretary called for an independent inquiry into Israel's killing of 7 aid workers, including 3 Britons. Now, I have repeatedly raised Israel, and particularly the IDF's lack of accountability and examples of misconduct with the Minister, and it is clear that here, as in other areas, the government is backtracking on the limited assurances given, despite investigations from the BBC, amongst others, showing IDF misconduct continues despite pledges and commitments to the contrary from Israel. So, will the Minister say yes or no? Does he believe that Israel should investigate itself, regardless of the horrors committed?
Well, as the Honourable Lady will know, Israel has a rule of law and has the ability to investigate these matters, but she is entirely correct to say that the Foreign Secretary made clear we expect an independent, a detailed independent investigation. Israel has taken a number of steps. She will have seen the acts that were taken against those who were responsible for the decisions made in those attacks. And she will be pleased to know that we are considering with our allies the best way to inject further independence into that investigation.
Mark Logan.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents in Bolton today are livid because they have seen through the International Criminal Court that there is evidence that acts committed to use starvation as method of war and violence, evidence that collectively punishing the civilian population of Gaza, and evidence that Israel has intentionally and systematically deprived the civilian population in all parts of Gaza of objects indispensable to human survival. Never mind being on the right side of history, will we ensure that we're on the right side of the present?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the fact that the prosecutor has applied for arrest warrants to be issued does not directly impact, for example, on UK licensing decisions, but we will continue to monitor developments as part of our assessment process. And once again, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman who acts as such a brilliant conduit between his constituents and the government, and I'm grateful for his work on that.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In the face of disgraceful attacks on aid trucks at the Gaza border, the Israeli Security Minister is reported to have said that he believes it is not protesters who should be stopping the trucks because it is the job of the Cabinet to stop the trucks. This view cannot be allowed to stand. Will the British government sanction the violent protesters who are destroying aid and their supporters within the Israeli government?
Well, as she will know, we have not been shy about sanctioning some of those who have conducted, some of the settlers who have been involved, and we don't talk about future sanctioning across the floor of the House, but she may rest assured that we are very alert to the opportunity for doing more on that. And she repeated what had been said by one senior Israeli official about the position in Rafah. She will know that that is not the position of most of the senior Israeli members of the Cabinet, and it's certainly not the position of the British government.
Tom Hunt.
Deputy Speaker, no organisation, international or otherwise, is beyond reproach, and it always gets it right. Of course, you can question what they come out with. What I find disturbing here, though, is there is almost an exact equivalence between Hamas leaders who carried out the most disgusting and brutal, deliberately targeted attacks on October 7th, and the leaders of Israel. It's not talking about a few rogue elements within Israel. This is what I find concerning. But does the Minister agree with me that it's really important to have solid and accurate data? We keep on hearing data that is coming from the Hamas-led health authority. We've had data over a weekend which is very different from that. Does the Minister agree that it would help the debate for as soon as possible for us in here to have that accurate data?
He is entirely right, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and he will have seen, as I have, the comments over the weekend about the figures, the accuracy of figures, and the very great likelihood that, in particular, the figures about women and children who have died during this contest are not accurate at all. So I agree with this point on that, and the point that he makes about moral equivalence, which has also been made this afternoon during this statement, Mr Deputy Speaker, is one that I think will be widely shared both inside and outside the House.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, the International Criminal Court, the highest criminal court in the world, has applied for arrest warrants for the Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Defence Minister Yoav Gallant for the war crimes of murder and the deliberate targeting of civilians, crimes against humanity and the deliberate starvation as a weapon of war against the people of Gaza. It's unequivocal. So does the UK Government now accept that it must do three key things? First, it must reconsider its unequivocal support to Israel by immediately suspending arms sales. It must call for an immediate ceasefire. And finally, it must restore funding to UNRWA so it can deliver emergency humanitarian aid.
Well, on his first point, I simply don't think that now is the time to make those decisions about what we have heard from the ICC today. It would be premature. There is now a pre-trial chamber which needs to consider the evidence and then reach a judgment. So I'm afraid I cannot go with him on that. On UNRWA, I have made very clear where we stand, and I hope that the aid that was delivered with British support by UNRWA in the future will be delivered, and I hope that UNRWA will be able to accept all the reforms that we are requesting, which would enable us to do that. And as I've also said, Mr Deputy Speaker, we are not in the position that we are withholding funding at the moment because we have fully funded up to the start of this month our commitments to UNRWA. And he says that we should cease our support for Israel. We have been very clear that Israel must abide within international humanitarian law, but equally that we understand that Israel has the right of self-defence.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Affairs Committee were in the Egyptian-Gaza border area in March, where we spoke with and visited a number of aid distribution centres, where we heard accounts of how some of the aid going into Gaza would be stopped because of the potential dual use of equipment, not just for humanitarian reasons, but also potentially being used by Hamas for military and terror reasons. Can he update the House as to the percentage of those trucks that are now getting through to deliver that aid?
Well, I can tell my honourable friend that the percentage, the number of trucks that are getting through is wholly inadequate. That is one of the reasons why we have made 12 airdrops, 11 by the Royal Air Force, and why we now have the maritime corridor. In terms of the restrictions on what can be transported by truck into Gaza, that was a very significant problem to begin with. That particular aspect has eased as both sides have understood the position of each on what is being taken into Gaza. But I'm afraid the amount of material humanitarian support getting in by trucks is still woefully inadequate.
Abdul Khan.
Mr Deputy Speaker, new polling by YouGov shows that 73% of the British public support an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, and 55% support the UK suspending arms sales to Israel for the duration of the conflict. Does the Minister recognise that his government is elected to represent the people of Britain, and will it finally represent the majority of the people in Britain and call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and suspend all arms sales to Israel?
Well, the honourable gentleman knows that on arms sales, it's not for the whim of a politician at the dispatch box to decide for and against. There is a proper process based on legal advice to be followed, and he would not expect ministers to deviate from that entirely proper way of judging these things. In respect to the ceasefire, we all want a ceasefire, but we want a sustainable ceasefire, and that is why the government has consistently pressed, indeed endorsed by a United Nations resolution, consistently pressed for a pause in the fighting to get the hostages out and allow aid in. That would be the way to lead to a sustainable ceasefire as a precursor for a longer-term deal. And the British government will continue, I hope, with his support and others on those benches to prosecute that endeavour.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. How can the Minister argue that his government respects international law when he denies the jurisdiction of the ICC in this conflict?
Well, I haven't denied the position of the ICC. What I've said is that we are at an early stage in this process, and we cannot reach those judgments. We cannot reach those judgments at this point.
Paulette Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We must not forget the civilians and their children are the innocent victims of this war. The UN says that 800,000 people have been forced to flee Rafah since the 6th of May. In Gaza, there is quite clearly nowhere left that is safe. So can the Minister explain what he thinks the consequences should be for any or all-out attack on Rafah of any forced displacement of civilians?
Well, the Honourable Lady is correct that something like 800,000 people have now left Rafah. We have managed to get in through the pier over the weekend 8,000 shelter kits, enough for around 40,000 people, but we are part of a growing consensus that is trying to provide that support. The Israeli Defence Force warned 400,000 people to leave. Almost double that have left, and we are doing everything we can to support them in their new locations. And as I have repeatedly made clear, we will not and cannot support an attack on Rafah without seeing a detailed plan, and we have not seen a detailed plan.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, could the Deputy Foreign Secretary tell us in specific terms what military flights are taking off from Akrotiri that go to Israel? Is the Israeli Defence Force using Akrotiri? Are the US forces using Akrotiri? And also, what is the nature of the overflying of Gaza by the RAF, and is surveillance information being sent to the IDF in response to that? In short, what is the military relationship between Britain and Israel at the present time? Very good question.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is an extremely senior member of this House, former leader of the Labour Party, and he well knows that we do not comment on security information across the floor of the House.
Can I just ask again, please could people just focus on the question, and also please remember that you would have had to have been here for the entirety of the statement in order to ask a question. So I'm taking on your word on that.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Other countries now have suspended arms sales. Other countries have restored the funding going forward to UNRWA. Why are we now leading from the behind rather than leading from the front on this? And is it not right that we now do the right thing, suspend arms sales and refund UNRWA?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think I'm right in saying that no country has suspended existing arms sales arrangements and agreements. But the fact remains that we have our own regime in this respect. We act in accordance with legal advice, and we will continue to do so. In respect of UNRWA, I have set out for the House the processes which we are going through, and he, like me, will hope that those processes will be successful.
Alex Sabel.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Deputy Foreign Secretary enjoyed referencing Mr. Gantz a number of times. He set out his conditions for the end of the war and a day after. In response, Prime Minister Netanyahu's spokesperson said, the conditions set by Benny Gantz are empty words. The meaning is clear, the end of the war. And he went on to say, establishing a Palestinian state. It is very clear now that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants a forever war and is opposed to a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. What is the UK government saying to Prime Minister Netanyahu to ensure that he understands where we in the international community stand on this issue, as do many Israelis, including members of his own government, and what actually is taking against Ben-Gvir, Smotrich and the Prime Minister of Israel, who are very clearly trying to prolong the war in Gaza?
Well, I say to the Honourable Gentleman that what he is saying underlines the fact that Israel is a pluralist democratic society where there are different views. And in respect, he asks me what the British government is saying to Prime Minister Netanyahu. I can assure him that both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have frank and open and detailed exchanges on these matters.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's the position of the Liberal Democrats that the UK government should give its backing to the ICC. If the Conservative government does not believe that the ICC has jurisdiction, then which international institution or legal mechanism does the UK government intend to look to ensure that any breaches of the law of war on the front line can be prosecuted?
Well, as the Honourable Lady knows, we make our own judgments on international humanitarian law, and we are quick to come to the House if anything changes. But nothing has changed since the Foreign Secretary made his comments in Washington, I think, in early April. I would just add to her that on the subject of the ICC's announcement today, I hope the House will accept that it is premature to respond further before the pre-trial chamber has considered the application for warrants.
Tom Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, which has today applied for arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Hamas leader and others, must be respected, contrary to what the Deputy Foreign Secretary said earlier. And I must correct the record for him, and he'd said, and I quote, "We do not think the ICC has jurisdiction in this case." So, Mr Deputy Speaker, given that the Israeli government has ignored for the past 3 months the UK Parliament's past motion as proposed by the Labour Party for an immediate ceasefire, but is now instead planning a full-scale offensive on Rafah, which would be an absolute humanitarian catastrophe, can the Deputy Foreign Secretary confirm that if that planned assault does go ahead, will the UK government suspend arms or component sales to Israel?
Well, Mr Deputy, it's very kind of him to seek to correct the record, but his repetition of what I said was absolutely correct, and we've said that from the outset, so he shouldn't be particularly surprised at that. And I can't foretell what the consequences will be in respect of Israeli actions, but I can tell him what the position of the British government is about an operation in Rafah, which does not respect international humanitarian law, and that is why we said that we cannot support it unless we see a detailed plan.
Debbie Abrahams.
Mr Deputy Speaker, on this side of the House, we believe that international law must be observed. As such, we want to see arms sales components sales being suspended, and we also want to see the perpetrators of violence against innocent civilians, whether Israeli or Palestinian, are held to account. I'm still unclear from the Deputy Foreign Secretary what he believes in and what his government believes in. Do you believe in the international law and upholding that?
Mr Deputy Speaker, it should come as no surprise to the House that the government, of course, not only believes in international humanitarian law, but seeks to uphold it. And I've set out very clearly in the House on a number of occasions exactly how we carry out our duties in that respect, and I hope that will give her confidence. And in respect of the International Criminal Court, I would say to her that she is jumping too far ahead. We've set out the limited decision that has been made and announced today, and we should not jump ahead of that.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Earlier on in the statement, the Deputy Foreign Secretary said the House should expect we will be restoring funding to UNRWA. It sounds like the government has made its mind up. If that decision has been made, given the absolutely horrendous humanitarian situation in Gaza, why don't we just get on with it? And if there is any chance that funding is not going to be restored, what's the government doing to get an alternative plan for that humanitarian aid to get in?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the government operates through other agencies as well as UNRWA. We've been very close indeed to the WFP, through which an enormous amount of humanitarian aid is distributed. And the point I would make to him about UNRWA is that we will go through these stages, which I've set out clearly to the House, but he can rest assured that from my discussions with the United Nations Secretary General in New York just over a week ago, we know that UNRWA is funded for the moment, and we hope that our own funding, subject to the results of the OIOS inquiry, subject to the implementation of the Kelowna report, will be restored.
Joanna Cherry.
Mr Deputy Speaker, on the issue of the jurisdiction of the ICC, the government's statement is out of step not just with the prosecutor, but also with the impartial independent panel of experts on international law from whom he sought advice, which consisted largely of lawyers from this jurisdiction, by that which I mean England and Wales, not my own. Here's what they said, and I want the Minister to tell me what part of this is wrong. The panel agrees with the prosecutor's assessment that the ICC has jurisdiction in relation to crimes committed on the territory of Palestine, including Gaza, under Article 12(2)A of the ICC statute. It also agrees that the court has jurisdiction over crimes committed by Palestinian nationals inside or outside Palestinian territory under Article 12(2)B of the statute. The ICC therefore has jurisdiction over Israeli, Palestinian or other nationals who committed crimes in Gaza or the West Bank. It also has jurisdiction over Palestinian nationals who committed crimes on the territory of Israel, even though Israel is not an ICC state party. The basis for the court's jurisdiction is that Palestine, including Gaza, is a state for the purpose of the ICC statute. The ICC's pre-trial chamber has already ruled that the court's jurisdiction extends to Palestine as a state party to the ICC statute on this basis. That is the opinion of an illustrious list of mainly English lawyers, with the exception of my dear colleague Baroness Helena Kennedy, who of course is a Scot, although at the English bar. Can the Minister, and I see he's got one of the law officers sitting beside him, can the Minister tell me which part of that opinion is wrong?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady is an immensely distinguished advocate and lawyer, and she will have read the letter signed by no less than 600 lawyers, which broadly agrees with what she has said. But she may also have read the letter from, I think, 1,000 lawyers who disagreed with that, which shows that there are many different interpretations on this matter. Hers is one, and the view of the government, as I've set out, is another.
Holly Lynn.
Mr Deputy Speaker, does the Deputy Foreign Secretary not recognise the damage that is being done to the UK's standing around the world on the rules-based international order and international humanitarian law? Firstly, with his government's refusal to accept the ICJ ruling and now the ICC. He says he does not believe that the ICC prosecutors seeking warrants will help, but at what point will he accept that the situation couldn't get any worse?
Absolutely.
Well, the point, Mr Deputy Speaker, we have always made is we do not think it is helpful for the court to intervene in this way at this point, because the main purpose is to get the hostages out and food and humanitarian resources in. And so that is the position that the British government takes. Of course we respect the court, but that doesn't mean that we can't give our view on what the court does.
Sir Chris Bryant.
Speaker, I rather agreed with the comments by the chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee earlier about the ICC, though I would gently point out that I don't think there's a single member of this House that supports the actions of Hamas on the October the 7th, and in fact every single one of us has rightly condemned them. And for that matter, even very long-standing friends of Israel have offered criticisms of the actions of the Israeli government over these last few months, as have many Israelis. But I wonder whether he can clarify something for me. He suggests that there are 800,000 Palestinians who have had to move out of Rafah in the last week or so. He also suggests that not enough humanitarian aid is getting through, and that is because the Israeli government is refusing to let it through. He has also said that the Israeli government has a right to defend itself. We all agree with that, but within the bounds of international humanitarian law. Who is to judge that international humanitarian law, if it is not an international court, surely it can't just be a set of politicians sitting in the Foreign Office making it up out of their own minds.
Well, on his last point, that is absolutely not the case. What ministers do is they take legal advice and they act within it, and they take legal advice on international humanitarian law. And we've been very clear that where we stand, the Foreign Secretary made the point in April, I think, in Washington. If anything changes, then of course we will tell the House. But we cannot act on the whim of politicians or ministers in the House. We act in accordance with the law, and that is what we will continue to do.
Rachel Hopkins.
Yes. Deputy Speaker, the Minister did say earlier that the Government condemns all attacks on aid workers and supports the UN call for an independent investigation into the killing of aid workers in Gaza. Can I ask the Minister if he is of the same view when it comes to the over 100 journalists who've been killed during the conflict?
Of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are appalled by the scale of death and destruction that has taken place. And what we say about protecting journalists, which is something this House has always championed, never more so than when my right honourable friend was Foreign Secretary, applies equally well.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. I've listened very carefully to the Deputy Foreign Secretary, and I have to say his arguments I find wanting. That the ICC thinks that there are reasonable grounds the actions of senior Hamas officials amount to war crimes matters. That they think that there's reasonable grounds that the operations authorised by Prime Minister Netanyahu and his Defence Minister amount to war crimes matters. Given that the ICC prosecutor believes he has acted within the Rome Statute, and as the UK is a state party to the ICC, will the United Kingdom uphold any application in this territory if requested by the Office of the Prosecutor?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman is premature in seeking to ask the government to exercise any such judgment. And as I said earlier in this statement, now is not the time to make these decisions. We need to wait for the pre-trial chamber to consider the evidence and then reach a judgment.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, any loss of innocent life, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is truly horrific and is to be avoided at any possibility. However, latest UN reports indicate that Hamas, who are murdering terrorists, as we all know, have inflated the statistics for death in the areas that have been proven to be massively overstated. What steps can be taken to ensure that we are all working for independently verified information and not propaganda, taking into account the fact that Israel have taken greater steps than any other democracy in history to give warning and circumvent the loss of innocent life as far as possible in this war?
Well, we do think, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that Israel must do more in terms of deconfliction. But he is right that the use of lawyers in targeting, the use of Israeli lawyers in the planning of military activity, not dissimilar to what we do in the United Kingdom, is very important. And I'm grateful to him for the balance which he has expressed, as he always does.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This country used not only to respect but champion international law. The Minister's dismissal of ICC procedures today confirms how far the government's fallen from its adherence to the rule of law. Why is the government undermining the court and its British chief prosecutor as he attempts to call to account war crimes, including extermination, murder, hostage-taking, starvation, targeting civilians and persecution as a crime against humanity?
Well, I'm surprised, Mr. Deputy Speaker, at the honourable gentleman putting it that way. He's an extremely distinguished lawyer, and I hope that he will recognise that the point I am making is that the House is rushing to conclusions which are not merited at this stage in the process.
Alistair Carmichael.
Speaker, whatever opinion the Minister has on the subject of jurisdiction, the arbiters on that as a point of law will be the judges of the ICC. So in the event that any or all of the warrants being sought by the Chief Prosecutor as announced today are to be granted, can the Minister confirm that the UK Government will render any assistance necessary for their execution? Is that not what a government that respects the rule of law would do?
Of course, Mr Deputy Speaker, what I can confirm is that the British Government will always act in accordance with the law.
Tommy Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. There is now a perception that the level of evidence that the United Kingdom Government requires to make a determination on whether war crimes have taken place and to act upon them seems to vary with its attitude towards the country being alleged to commit those war crimes. Does the Deputy Foreign Secretary not understand the irreparable damage that's being done to the reputation of the United Kingdom internationally as a defender of international humanitarian law by this inconsistency?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I simply do not recognise the honourable gentleman's description of what the British Government is doing. The British Government is absolutely consistent. It always acts in accordance with the rule of law and will always continue to do so.
Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. For the avoidance of any doubt for members across the Chamber, I have since 2007 opposed Hamas and opposed their atrocities on October the 7th and continue to do that. So there are no sides as far as I'm concerned. I think the actions taken by the IDF need to be corrected as well, and we don't need to be held to account on that. The Deputy Foreign Secretary has said to my right honourable friend that the ICC is not in jurisdiction. To the SNP spokesman, he said that the pre-judgment court hasn't read. To the learned lady in the SNP, he has said that we have to wait until it's not the right moment. Does he believe the ICC has jurisdiction on this issue, and will he give a straight answer, yes or no?
So, Mr Deputy Speaker, first of all, I'm grateful for his condemnation over many years of Hamas. And he has repeated what I have said to other members of the House this afternoon. If I've understood him correctly, he is noting that I have been entirely consistent in all those responses.
Sir Edwards.
The Deputy Speaker, what are the steps that the Government is taking with our international allies to help create the conditions needed for an immediate ceasefire that can be observed by both sides?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Britain was able, through some skillful and deft diplomacy, to get everyone on side on the United Nations resolution, which was recently passed, which talked about a sustainable ceasefire. And the position that Britain has always held is that we need to get that pause to enable us to get the hostages out and to get humanitarian supplies in, and the hope that that pause would lead to a sustainable ceasefire.
Howell Williams.
Mr Deputy Speaker, neither the USA nor China nor Russia are party to the ICC. Does the Minister therefore recognise that as permanent members of the Security Council, the UK along with France have a special responsibility to support the ICC and to uphold international law?
The honourable gentleman will have noticed that today I have been careful to be very clear about our support for the ICC, but equally to urge the House not to rush to judgment in a process which has a number of stages.
I apologise to those who didn't get in, but we will take notice of your names and get you in at another time. We now have to move on.
Points of order come after statements. Yep. Rules of the House. But he didn't speak, so it couldn't be. The Prime Minister has requested to make a short statement on today's publication of the final report of the Infected Blood Inquiry. On this occasion, given the nature of the statement, I've agreed that there will only be a few limited brief responses today, as there will be a further major statement tomorrow when all honourable members will have the opportunity to question the Cabinet Office Minister at length. I now call the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, Sir Brian Langstaff has today published the final report of the Infected Blood Inquiry. This is a day of shame for the British state. Today's report shows a decades-long moral failure at the heart of our national life. From the National Health Service to the civil service, to ministers in successive governments, at every level, the people and institutions in which we place our trust failed in the most harrowing and devastating way. They failed the victims and their families, and they failed this country. Sir Brian finds a catalogue of systemic, collective, and individual failures, each on its own serious and taken together amounting to a calamity. And the result of this inquiry should shake our nation to its core. This should have been avoided. It was known these treatments were contaminated. Warnings were ignored repeatedly. Time and again, people in positions of power and trust had the chance to stop the transmission of those infections. Time and again, they failed to do so. Sir Brian finds an attitude of denial towards the risks of treatment. Worse, to our eternal shame, in a way that it is hard to even comprehend, they allowed victims to become objects for research. Many, including children, at Lord Mayor Treloar's College were part of trials conducted without their or their parents' knowledge or consent. Those with haemophilia or bleeding disorders were infected with HIV, hepatitis C, and hepatitis B through NHS treatment, through blood clotting products such as Factor VIII, including those who had been misdiagnosed and did not even require treatment. Many were infected through whole blood transfusions. Others were infected through their partners and loved ones, often after diagnoses had been deliberately withheld for months or even years, meaning these infections should have easily been prevented. I find it almost impossible to comprehend how it must have felt to be told you had been infected through no fault of your own with HIV or hepatitis B or hepatitis C, or to face the grief of losing a child, or to be a young child and lose your mum or dad. Many of those infected went on to develop horrific conditions, including cirrhosis, liver cancer, pneumonia, TB, and AIDS, enduring debilitating treatments like interferon for these illnesses the NHS had given them. Many were treated disdainfully by healthcare professionals who made appalling assumptions about the origin of their infections. Worse still, they were made to think that they were imagining it, made to feel stupid. They felt abandoned by the NHS that had infected them. Those who acquired HIV endured social rejection, vilification, and abuse at a time when society understood so little about the emerging epidemic of AIDS. And with illness came the indignity of financial hardship, including for carers and those widowed and other bereaved family members. And throughout it all, victims and their loved ones have had to fight for justice, fight to be heard, to be believed, fight to uncover the full truth. Some had their medical records withheld or even destroyed, and the inquiry finds that some government papers were destroyed in a deliberate attempt to make the truth more difficult to reveal. Sir Brian explicitly asks the question, was there a cover-up? Let me directly quote his answer for the House. There has been. He continues, not in the sense of a handful of people plotting in an orchestrated conspiracy to mislead, but in a way that was more subtle, more pervasive, and more chilling in its implications. To save face and to save expense, there has been a hiding of much of the truth. Mr. Speaker, more than 3,000 people died without that truth. They died without an apology. They died without knowing how and why this was allowed to happen. And they died without seeing anyone held to account. Today I want to speak directly to the victims and their families, some of whom are with us in the gallery. I want to make a wholehearted and unequivocal apology for this terrible injustice. First, to apologise for the failure in blood policy and blood products and the devastating and so often fatal impact this had on so many lives, including the impact of treatments that were known or proved to be contaminated, the failure to respond to the risk of imported concentrates, the failure to prioritise self-sufficiency in blood, the failure to introduce screening services sooner, and the mismanagement of the response to the emergence of AIDS and hepatitis viruses amongst infected blood victims. Second, to apologise for the repeated failure of the state and our medical professionals to recognise the harm caused. This includes the failure of previous payment schemes, the inadequate levels of funding made available, and the failure to recognise hepatitis B victims. And third, to apologise for the institutional refusal to face up to these failings, and worse, to deny and even attempt to cover them up. The dismissing of reports and campaigners' detailed representations, the loss and destruction of key documents, including ministerial advice and medical records, and the appalling length of time it took to secure the public inquiry which has delivered the full truth today. Mr. Speaker, layer upon layer of hurt endured across decades. This is an apology from the state to every single person impacted by this scandal. It did not have to be this way. It should never have been this way. And on behalf of this and every government stretching back to the 1970s, I am truly sorry. Mr. Speaker, today is a day for the victims and their families, to hear the full truth acknowledged by all, and, in the full presence of that truth, to remember the many, many lost loved ones. But justice also demands action and accountability. So I make two solemn promises. First, we will pay comprehensive compensation to those infected and those affected by this scandal, accepting the principles recommended by the inquiry, which builds on the work of Sir Robert Francis. Whatever it costs to deliver this scheme, we will pay it. And my right honourable friend, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, will set out the details tomorrow. Second, it is not enough to say sorry, pay long overdue compensation, and then attempt to move on. There can be no moving on from a report that is so devastating in its criticisms. Of course, in some areas, medical practice has long since evolved, and no one is questioning that every day our NHS provides amazing and life-saving care to the British people. But Sir Brian and his team have made wide-ranging recommendations. We will study them in detail before returning to this House with a full response. And we must fundamentally rebalance the system so we finally address this pattern so familiar from other inquiries like Hillsborough, where innocent victims have to fight for decades just to be believed. Mr. Speaker, the whole House will join me in thanking Sir Brian and his team, especially for keeping the infected blood community at the heart of their work. We would not be here today without those who tirelessly fought for justice for so many years. I include journalists and parliamentarians in both houses, especially the Right Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull North. But most of all, the victims and their families, many of whom have dedicated their lives leading charities and campaign groups, pouring their own money into decades of running helplines, archiving, researching, pursuing legal cases, often in the face of appalling prejudice. It is impossible to capture the full pain and injustice they have faced. Their sorrow has been unimaginable. They have watched loved ones die, cared for them as they suffered excruciating treatments or provided their palliative care. Many families were broken up by the strain. hundreds of thousands of lives have been knocked off course, dreams and potential unfulfilled. But today, their voices have finally been heard. The full truth stands for all to see. And we will work together across government, our health services and civil society to ensure that nothing like this can ever happen in our country again. I commend this statement to the House.
Call Keir Starmer, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This response can only begin in one place, because this is an injustice that has spanned across governments on an unprecedented scale, and collectively we fail to protect some of the most vulnerable in our country. And so, as well as paying tribute to the courage and determination of the victims, the infected and the affected, some of whom are here in the gallery today, I want to acknowledge to every single person who has suffered that in addition to all of the other failings, politics itself failed you. That failure applies to all parties, including my own. There is only one word: sorry. And by that apology, I acknowledge that this suffering was caused by wrongdoing, delay, and systemic failure across the board, compounded by institutional defensiveness. And as Sir Brian Langstaff makes clear in his report, any apology today must be accompanied by action. And so I welcome the Prime Minister's confirmation that compensation will now be paid. And he should be under no doubt whatsoever that we will work with him to get that done swiftly. Because make no mistake, the victims in this scandal have suffered unspeakably. Thousands of people have died. They continue to die every week. Lives completely shattered, evidence willfully destroyed, victims marginalised, people watching their loved ones die, children used as objects of research. On and on it goes. The pain barely conceivable. And so, as well as an apology, I also want to make clear we commit that we will shine a harsh light upon the lessons that must be learned to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Because, Mr. Speaker, when you pass through the doors of a hospital, it is a moment of profound vulnerability. You entrust your life into the hands of perfect strangers. We go to hospital for care. And that is what many of the people affected find so hard to accept, the betrayal of that trust by people and institutions that were meant to protect them. People like Mark Stewart, my constituent, who was given Factor 8 in the 1980s as part of a clinical trial, as was his father, as was his brother. All three subsequently contracted hepatitis C. But only Mark remains with us today. And then over the decades, as Mark and so many like him searched for truth and justice, the British state ignored them. The truth, as Sir Brian says today, was hidden from them for decades. And that is why this is one of the gravest injustices this country has seen. And yet we have to be honest. This scandal is not unique. And the institutional defensiveness identified by Sir Brian is a pattern of behaviour that we must address. Because, Mr. Speaker, while Mark may never get his brother, his father, or his health back, for all the families affected, We must restore the sense that this is a country that can rectify injustice, particularly when carried out by institutes of the state. That is our job today, this week, and beyond. Frankly, it is the very least that we owe. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for the collegiate tone in which he has responded to today's report and his sincerity. He is right, it is irrefutably clear that an unconscionable injustice has been done, the result of a consistent and systemic failure by the state time and again for decade after decade, and it's why I apologise wholeheartedly and unequivocally to every single person impacted by this scandal. And the anger and sorrow felt across this House is the right response. And it is right that we now act on behalf of the victims, their loved ones, and the whole community who expect us to put right this historic wrong.
Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
The thousands of people at Central Hall thanked Sir Brian Langstaff. He thanked them. We should acknowledge, as has already been said, the Right Honourable Lady for Hull North and her leadership of the all-party group. Can I say to my right honourable friend that permanent secretaries and cabinet secretaries need to say to everyone throughout their chain, are we doing something which is right? Are we doing something which is necessary? Are we doing something which will work? If those questions had been asked more effectively, would my right honourable friend agree that the number of tragedies would not have been 5 for every MP in this House, not 5 times more for everyone who's injured or affected, but the numbers would have been greatly reduced and we'd have learnt the truth earlier.
Well, can I start, Mr. Speaker, by thanking my right honourable friend for his dedicated work co-chairing alongside the member for Kingston upon Hull North, the all-party parliamentary group on haemophilia and contaminated blood. And I can assure him that Sir Brian's report is highly detailed and sets out a number of recommendations, and I can assure my right honourable friend that we will respond to it in full as quickly as possible.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to begin by stating something which I think we all now agree is self-evidently the case, that this scandal represents the very worst of Westminster. Decades of deflection, decades of denial, and of course decades of deceit. Children used as research, parents watching their children die, children watching their parents die, tens of thousands of people impacted, many of whom of course are not here to see this day. And for those who imposed this tragedy upon them, no consequences have yet been felt. But today is not about them, today is about the victims. And to them, on behalf of myself and my colleagues in the Scottish National Party on these benches, I wish to offer you 3 things. First is an apology. I am incredibly sorry that this happened to you. Second is to say quite openly, thank you. Thank you for your determination and your desire, for being able to pry open the doors of this place and ensure that your voices were heard by all of us. We would not be here today without your efforts. And thirdly, Mr. Speaker, it's to say to the victims that I can assure you, we will do everything that we can to ensure that the government implements the recommendations as laid out today. Now, I've heard the Prime Minister make a very sincere promise in relation to compensation. And I would like to say to him that we will work with him and his government, and indeed any future government, to ensure that that promise is swiftly kept.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I welcome the absolute consensus that today is a moment for the families and the community and their voices to be heard loudest. Every single testimony and account set out in Sir Brian's report today sets out a unique story of hurt, suffering and loss. Individually, these accounts are astounding. Taken together, they are truly unimaginable. They must be heard and they must be understood, as the honourable gentleman said. And I thank him for his remarks, and I know that we share a determination to work together to ensure that nothing like this shocking and avoidable calamity can ever happen in our country again.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Speaker. Sir Brian Langstaff's report today has finally uncovered the truth of this appalling tragedy which has affected the lives of so many. And so many have been fighting, as the Prime Minister said and the Leader of the Opposition said, for decades to get to this point. Sir Brian has highlighted what is a devastating and abject failure of the British state. Medical professionals, civil servants, politicians, all of whom felt their job was to protect their own reputation, rather than to serve and look after the public who they were there to serve. As we rightly today remember all the victims of this terrible tragedy, will my right honourable friend commit himself unashamedly to working to ensure that all those in government, politicians and civil servants, recognise that their job is to serve the public and not to protect themselves?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend for her statement as Prime Minister. She launched Sir Brian's inquiry and in doing so began the process of establishing the full truth we have heard today. There is no doubt, as she recognises, that the inquiry came too late, that compensation came too late, was woefully insufficient, and the consequences of that failure are stark. And that is why today I apologise on behalf of governments since the 1970s for that shameful failure. But I can also assure her that Sir Brian and his team have made a series of wide-ranging recommendations, and we will study every single one of them in detail and work urgently across government and public organisations, our health services and civil society, all to ensure that nothing like this can ever happen again, but also that we end the challenges that she encountered, where the institutions responsible for serving the public, including the NHS and civil service, are more concerned by cost than accountability.
Ed David.
Mr. Speaker, today is about the tens of thousands of people whose lives have been torn apart by this disaster. Many of them have fought and waited for decades to see this day, and tragically thousands have died waiting, as the Prime Minister reminded us. I pay tribute to the survivors, the families, the campaigners and the journalists who fought so long and so hard for justice. Having listened to their stories and now seen the evidence laid bare in this report, I want, on behalf of my party, to echo the Prime Minister's apology. We are all truly sorry for the pain people have suffered over decades under governments of all parties, and for the failures of politicians and the state to do the most fundamental job to keep people safe. We must now ensure full compensation is paid without any more delay, and we must also make sure that nothing like this can ever happen again. In his report, Sir Brian highlights how, and I quote, "The truth has been hidden for decades through a lack of openness, transparency and candour that has caused enormous damage." So will the Prime Minister join me in backing the survivors' call for a duty of candour on all public officials?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his remarks. Across this House, we share a determination to work together to ensure that nothing comparable to this shocking and avoidable tragedy can happen ever again in our country. Today is the day for the victims and their families to hear the full truth, unequivocally acknowledged by all, and to remember the many, many lost loved ones. So the Minister for the Cabinet Office will be making a full statement tomorrow, but we will study every one of Sir Brian's recommendations in detail and work urgently across all parts of civil society to ensure innocent victims are never again forced to fight for decades to be believed.
Sajid Javid.
I welcome the statement by my right honourable friend and indeed the words of the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this scandal, the biggest in the history of the NHS, but also Mid Staffordshire, Ockenden, the Cash Review, all of these scandals are linked by public servants putting the reputation of themselves and the NHS above that of patient safety and care. And time again, ministers have stood at that dispatch box of the successive governments, including myself, promising that lessons will be learned. So can I ask my right honourable friend, why will it be any different this time?
Mr. Speaker, Sir Brian's report is categoric that this scandal represents a decades-long moral failure of the state, but in particular he highlights an appalling truth, that our National Health Service failed. It was known that blood and blood products given by medical professionals were contaminated. It is correct to acknowledge that medical practice has evolved. Every day, hundreds of thousands of our NHS staff do provide life-saving care to the British people, and we are incredibly grateful. But the report today sets out clear and wide-ranging recommendations that we must study closely, and we will work urgently with our health services to ensure that nothing like this will ever happen again.
Final person on this is Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and his apology on behalf of the nation? Can I also thank Sir Brian for his report today? Finally, the truth. It's a vindication of the nearly 50 years of campaign justice, and I want to pay tribute to all those infected and affected, and also, importantly, those who've lost their lives in the biggest treatment disaster of the history of the NHS, with 2 people dying on average still every week. I wondered if the Prime Minister understands that whilst accepting the moral case for compensation to be paid in December 2022, the failure of his government to act on the second interim report by Sir Brian in April 23 has added another layer of hurt. And I hope very much from what the Prime Minister has said this afternoon that by the end of this year, compensation payments will start to be made to all those infected and affected.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Lady for her statement and for her care and unwavering dedication to delivering justice. She knows better than anyone in this House the devastation this scandal has inflicted upon the community and the strength they have shown in their fight for the truth. Sir Brian's report sets out a decades-long failure and makes clear that this is a moment of national shame. No one could be failed to be moved by the stories within it, by the utterly shameful treatment of victims and their loved ones, by the callousness and the cruelty that they suffered, by their outstanding bravery and resilience and refusal to yield to a lifetime of prejudice and trauma. They have fought for the truth to be out. They were right. And above all, today is a day for their voices to be heard.
That completes this short statement. Tomorrow there will be a full statement. Can I finish first, please? Tomorrow there will be a full statement where all the details of compensation will be brought to the House and all members will be able to get it. Pete Wishart.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Have you received any explanation why we're only getting half an hour of the Prime Minister's time? Now, I know there's going to be a statement tomorrow from the Paymaster General, and we're all looking forward to it. But what could be more important than this, than being here, taking questions from honourable members?
I'll answer the question. You've asked me the question. I've worked very closely with different parties, and more importantly, and very importantly, it is about the families. It's their day, and that's why it's been done in this way. And I'm sure you will wish to respect that rather than question it. Right.
Order, I will let the chamber clear as quickly as possible.